The summer night in West Hollywood was heavy with heat. The kind of heat that holds the air still, as though the city itself were holding its breath. In the Franklin Towers, a modest building where Dorothy Dandridge had lived in her final years, the lights behind her curtains glowed faintly. Yet inside, there was only silence. Neighbors would later recall that her telephone line was strangely engaged, as if left dangling, the receiver resting off its cradle. It was the first signal that something was not as it should be. The voice of Dorothy, once so commanding on screen and stage, now gone quiet in her own home. When they found her, she was lying on the floor beside her bed. Not on the bed, not prepared for sleep, but collapsed mid-motion, as though she had been interrupted on the way to somewhere else. Around her, the apartment was orderly. Nothing broken, no signs of chaos, no desperate note left behind. Just Dorothy, silent at 37, her phone disconnected from the world. The scene carried its own contradictions. To some, it whispered of sudden illness, an unfortunate end to a life already marked by struggles. To others, it felt staged, too still, too quiet, as if something had been erased before anyone arrived. And hovering over all of it was the sense of abrupt interruption. A star extinguished not in the frenzy of scandal, but in a room too neat, too undisturbed, with only the off-the-hook telephone breaking the illusion. The medical examiner would later record that she died from an overdose of antidepressants, imipramine, a drug meant to steady her. Yet as those words were inked into the official record, questions multiplied. How much had she taken? Why was no glass of water nearby? No open bottle of pills scattered around her? What led her to the floor instead of her bed? Like a film cut before its final scene, the details remained jagged, incomplete. Outside, the city went on with its ordinary rhythm. Neon lights hummed, cars rolled along Sunset Boulevard, and the entertainment industry turned to its next obsession. But within that apartment, a story ended without a proper conclusion. It was not simply the death of an actress. It was the silencing of someone who had fought to be seen, a woman who had carried both triumph and torment in equal measure. The silence of that room the phone abandoned, the air unmoving, echoed with something deeper. In psychological terms, silence is rarely empty. It is filled with the weight of what is absent, with the memory of what should be present. Dorothy's silence was more than the absence of sound. It was the echo of a life that once demanded attention, now reduced to a final unanswered call. The mirror in her bedroom stood unbroken, reflecting nothing but shadows. A reminder that she had once been the reflection for an entire generation. A face on screens across America, the symbol of beauty and poise. Yet mirrors only give back what stands before them. And that night, the mirror bore only the darkness of the room, as though her image had already begun to vanish. It is here, in this locked apartment, that her story begins not with applause, but with silence. A silence that invites questions, one that has never truly been filled, even decades later. Because when the world loses a star, the question is never only how, it is also why. Long before her name became a whisper in the hallways of Franklin Towers, Dorothy Dandridge's face illuminated theaters across the country. She was not just another Hollywood beauty. She was the black leading lady in an era that denied her very existence as such. Born in 1922-inch Cleveland, Dorothy's earliest memories were shaped by the rhythm of her mother's determination and the sting of exclusion. Her mother, Ruby, an actress herself, nurtured Dorothy's talents from childhood, guiding her toward the stage as if it were the only safe place where brilliance might be allowed to shine. Dorothy's childhood was spent moving through smoky clubs and small-time venues, first as part of a singing act called the Wonder Children, then as one half of the Dandridge Sisters. On those stages, she learned to smile under hot lights, to command applause with a voice too mature for her years. Yet even in those early days, another lesson sank deep into her. The applause faded quickly once the curtain fell. and the world outside treated her talent as novelty, not destiny. By the 1942nd, her beauty had become undeniable to Hollywood. Yet beauty alone was never enough. Studios wanted her exoticized, boxed into roles of maids, chorus girls, and background singers. She was dazzling, but always placed in the margins. To cast Dorothy as a lead would mean acknowledging that white audiences, could fall in love with a black woman. That truth was too dangerous for Hollywood to fully embrace. And then came Carmen Jones, 1954. Dorothy, with her sculpted cheekbones and voice like velvet steel, embodied the title role with a ferocity that stunned critics. Here she was, not in the background, but in the center, magnetic, dangerous, alive. For the first time, a black actress was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress. She did not win, but the nomination itself was a breach in the wall, a crack in Hollywood's careful segregation. But even as she walked red carpets in gowns that glistened under camera flashes, there was a strange duality in her presence. Dorothy was celebrated for her beauty, her sophistication, her acceptability to white America, yet she was simultaneously barred from hotels where she performed, refused entrance to restaurants in the very cities where her name lit up marquees. Fame wrapped around her like a glittering gown, but just beneath it was the constant friction of exclusion. There is an old psychological motif, the mask. For Dorothy, the mask was not just makeup or performance. It was survival. To remain poised, graceful, unshaken in a world that sought to diminish her. She wore composure as armor. Each smile, each perfectly measured gesture, was a shield against the raw loneliness behind it. Success had placed her on a pedestal, but the pedestal was narrow, fragile, and surrounded by shadows. The contradiction was haunting. She was America's most visible black actress, yet she lived in near invisibility when it came to genuine acceptance. In every studio meeting, in every hotel lobby, she carried not only her own ambition, but also the burden of representation. She was told she was too beautiful to be cast opposite a black leading man. Audiences would not believe it, they said. She was told white actors could not be paired with her romantically, either. In essence, Hollywood trapped her in its own impossible geometry, where her stardom could only ever be partial, incomplete. Still, for those who watched her on screen, Dorothy seemed to shimmer with possibility. There is a moment in Carmen Jones where she turns her head toward the camera, her eyes glinting, her smile sly but vulnerable. It is a look that suggests she knew the paradox she embodied. That to be desired was not the same as being accepted. That to be adored was not the same as being safe. Every time Dorothy appeared before the mirror in her dressing room, adjusting a strap, reapplying lipstick, she was not simply preparing for a role. She was negotiating her identity between how the world saw her and how she wished to be remembered. The reflection never lied, but it rarely gave comfort. The mirror only told her, "You are visible, but you are also trapped." It was this duality, this shimmering contradiction of triumph and alienation, that made Dorothy Dandridge more than a star. She was a pioneer whose success bore the taste of sacrifice. And as history would show, that sacrifice carried a cost so steep that it would eventually break her. Dorothy Dandridge's life in the spotlight was dazzling from the outside, but behind the velvet curtains of her career lay a gnawing solitude that deepened with each passing year. Fame had opened doors, but it had also built walls that grew higher as her personal struggles multiplied. Her first marriage to Harold Nicholas, of the famed Nicholas brothers, was a union of glamour that quickly turned to disillusion. Nicholas, while gifted on stage, lived a life untethered at home. He chased pleasures, absented himself from family duties, and left Dorothy to bear the weight of both motherhood and her own rising career. Their daughter, Carolyn Suzanne, was born with brain damage, a tragedy that reshaped Dorothy's world forever. The diagnosis was delivered quietly, but devastatingly, her child would never fully develop speech, never truly live independently. In a world that already demanded perfection from her, Dorothy found herself carrying a burden too heavy for one pair of shoulders. There is something particularly cruel about the way isolation sharpens under fame. For Dorothy, every public appearance required polish and charm, yet behind closed doors, she was confronted by the ceaseless reality of her daughter's condition. She sought the best care, the most advanced treatments available. But medicine in the mid-20th century offered little hope. The mirror that once reflected glamour now reflected exhaustion, her eyes weary, her smiles thinner, her beauty haunted by shadows. Her romantic life, too, was punctuated by disappointment and disillusion. Relationships with powerful men promised comfort, but often ended in betrayal or exploitation. Dorothy was drawn to men who seemed capable of shielding her from the world's cruelty. Yet they often became another source of it. One lover left her emotionally drained, another financially exploited her, and others simply failed to understand the gravity of her inner loneliness. Each relationship chipped away at her hope, leaving her more adrift, more unwilling to trust. It is here that the psychological motif of the closed room becomes striking. Dorothy's life often unfolded behind doors, hotel rooms she could not enter, apartments where she hid from the world, the private spaces where she folded her grief neatly away from public view. Even at the height of her success, she was often alone, the applause echoing in rooms that emptied the moment the lights dimmed. Her career, once lit by the flames of Carmen Jones, began to dim in the late 1952nd. Offers were scarce, and the few that arrived were often demeaning, roles designed to reduce her to background stereotypes she had already fought to transcend. She turned to nightclubs, performing in glamorous gowns under smoky lights, her voice still carrying the sensual timbre that could hush an audience. Yet even in these rooms, she was haunted by a sense of impermanence. Crowds adored her, but they were transient faces that shifted nightly, applause that faded into silence. Isolation bred vulnerability, and vulnerability bred despair. Dorothy began leaning on antidepressants to soothe her restless nights, to quiet the anxieties that circled her mind. Pills became companions, lined neatly on bathroom shelves, their small glass bottles whispering promises of rest. It is said that those who rely on such comforts often blur the line between use and dependence. For Dorothy, the line was thin, sometimes invisible, as her life became a delicate balance between the stage's applause and the silence of her bedroom. There is a psychological truth that isolation magnifies pain. Without a confidant, without someone to absorb our darkest fears, the mind turns inward, echoing its own despair until it becomes unbearable. Dorothy's world was filled with mirrors and eyes, mirrors reflecting the star she was, eyes watching for the star she should always remain, but she had few who could hold her sorrow without judgment. And so, fame wrapped itself around her like a glittering shroud. To the world, she was still radiant, poised, beautiful. But beauty has always been a fragile mask, one that conceals as much as it reveals. Beneath it, Dorothy Dandridge lived a life of exquisite loneliness, a life where the spotlight illuminated everything except the shadows within. Hollywood in the 1952nd and 62nd was not a place of honesty. It was a labyrinth of illusions, a city that breathed in dreams and exhaled masks. For Dorothy Dandridge, this world of mirages both exalted her and consumed her. She was celebrated as a beauty, courted by producers, photographed in gowns that shimmered beneath flashbulbs. Yet behind the glamour, the machinery of Hollywood worked tirelessly to control her, to dictate who she could be and who she could never become. The contradiction was stark. Dorothy could appear on the screen as a temptress, a heroine, even a tragic lover, but she could not share the same hotel pool as her white co-stars. There were nights when she would step onto a stage, dressed in silk, her voice lulling audiences into reverie, and then retire to a hotel where she was forbidden to use the front entrance, a city of glittering lights, but always with shadows large enough to swallow her whole. Hollywood loved to craft myths, and Dorothy was fashioned into one, the Black Marilyn Monroe, they called her. But unlike Marilyn, who wrestled with her own tragedies within the system, Dorothy carried the heavier burden of race. She could be adored, but not fully embraced, desired, but not allowed to truly belong. It was as if the city had extended its hand to her, then swiftly pulled it back whenever she reached for more. The motif of masks is almost too fitting for this chapter of her life. At every gala, every studio event, Dorothy wore the mask of effortless grace, a smile that suggested belonging, a laugh that smoothed over insults. Yet masks are heavy when worn too long. Beneath the powder and rouge, beneath the sequined gowns, there lingered the exhaustion of a woman constantly required to perform, not just on stage, but in life itself. The mirage was no less cruel in her personal affairs. Men of power whispered promises of opportunity, but those promises dissolved like smoke when she tried to grasp them. Some lovers desired her only as an ornament, a secret, a conquest. Others recoiled from the social backlash of being seen with her. Dorothy stood at the edge of acceptance, forever suspended, never permitted to cross over fully. Her attempts to navigate this treacherous city left scars both visible and invisible. Financial instability gnawed at her lavish performances, brought applause, but little security. Managers misused her trust, siphoning funds, leaving her in debt while she was still headlining clubs. Hollywood's illusion of wealth had betrayed her. Behind the curtain, Dorothy was struggling to pay bills, to keep her daughter cared for, to maintain the facade of a star still shining brightly. There is a chilling psychological truth about environments built on illusion. They can devour those who dare to live authentically. Dorothy longed not only for recognition but for honesty, for a world where she could love openly, raise her child without shame, walk into a room without measuring every glance. Hollywood gave her crowns and cameras, but never the one thing she most needed: freedom. By the early 1962nd, Dorothy had begun to fade from the industry's gaze. New faces arrived, fresh illusions spun. The city that had once draped her in gold now treated her like a shadow slipping behind the screen. It is a cruel irony Hollywood can immortalize and erase at the same time. For Dorothy, the applause was already growing faint, as if her story was being quietly erased while she was still alive. Mirrors lined her dressing rooms, hotel suites, and apartment walls. Each one reflected a woman the world wanted to see. Radiant, controlled, enchanting. But when she faced them alone, she sometimes wondered if the reflection belonged to her at all, or to the mirage Hollywood had carefully constructed. And in that doubt, in that distance between reality and illusion, a quiet despair began to grow. Hollywood had given Dorothy Dandridge everything that glitters, except the truth. And without truth, even the brightest lights can feel like darkness. The 7th of September, 1965, began like any other day in Los Angeles. The sky was a washed-out blue, the heat lingering long after summer should have broken. Dorothy Dandridge spent that evening alone in her apartment at Franklin Towers, a quiet high-rise that looked down on the restless city. It was not unusual for her to withdraw into solitude. Friends and neighbors were accustomed to the ebb and flow of her presence, the way she seemed to vanish into silence for days at a time. But that night, the silences became peculiar. She had spoken to friends on the phone earlier in the evening. One recalled her voice sounding steady, even lighthearted. Another claimed she seemed distracted, as if her thoughts were tangled somewhere out of reach. Later, when her line was found off the hook, still humming its empty signal, those calls would become the subject of uneasy speculation. Why would she leave the receiver abandoned? Was she reaching for someone, or cutting herself off entirely? Accounts of her last movements vary, a fog of contradictions that refuses to lift. Some say she spent the evening rehearsing for an upcoming performance, humming to herself in front of her mirror. Others insist she had spoken about financial troubles weighing heavily on her. There were even rumors she had confided fears of betrayal, whispers of unpaid debts, and men who did not have her best interests at heart. It is the contradictions that haunt the narrative. Dorothy was, by some accounts, preparing for a new chapter, ready to return to performing, even to star in a nightclub engagement. Yet the apartment told a different story. No preparations left out, no notes written, no suitcase packed. Instead, a life interrupted in mid-breath, as though she had simply stopped moving. Objects in the room held their own quiet testimonies. The mirror above her dresser stood untouched. A gown hung neatly in her closet, her shoes aligned as if waiting for a night out that never came. These traces speak to a life not in disarray, but in pause frozen. And there, at the heart of it, Dorothy herself collapsed beside her bed. The coroner's clock would later fix the hour of death sometime during that night. But clocks cannot capture the atmosphere, the oppressive stillness that must have gathered around her. The apartment windows, still open to the warm night, allowed the city's neon glow to seep inside. Out on Sunset Boulevard, laughter and music pulsed through the air. But inside Franklin Towers, a silence spread, swallowing every trace of sound. In psychology, moments of liminality, the spaces between states, are where the mind begins to fracture. Dorothy's last night was just such a liminal space, between a return to performance and the weight of despair, between the intimacy of phone conversations and the isolation of a locked apartment, between the mirage of her past fame and the reality of her fading present. It was in this twilight space, neither fully light nor dark, that she spent her final hours. The morning brought discovery. Friends who tried to reach her by phone found only the dead hum of a line left open. By the time her body was found, the mystery had already begun. Why had the line been left that way? Was it a call for help, interrupted before she could finish? Or was it a deliberate act, a refusal to answer, a symbolic disconnection from the world she had long endured? The night of shadows left no witnesses, only contradictions. A star who had lived her life between two worlds, desired yet denied, admired yet isolated, had departed in a way that mirrored her existence, ambiguous, unresolved, and quietly tragic. The official story came swiftly, almost too swiftly, as though Hollywood itself needed closure before questions could take root. Dorothy Dandridge, they said, had died of an overdose, an excess of imipramine, an antidepressant prescribed to steady her spiraling moods. The words were clean, clinical, stripped of emotion. Acute imipramine poisoning. A phrase that explained everything and nothing at once. Autopsy reports are meant to bring certainty, to impose order on chaos. Yet Dorothy's report carried shadows between its lines. The dose detected in her bloodstream was lethal, yes, but questions arose. How much had she truly taken, and under what circumstances? No empty pill bottle lay scattered across the floor. No glass of water stood nearby. No evidence of panic or disorder. The scene was disturbingly tidy. Too tidy, some whispered, for a sudden and accidental overdose. The coroner noted other things: a fractured toe, bruises inconsistent with a simple collapse, traces of mystery that the report itself seemed unwilling to amplify. Instead, these details were tucked into the margins, easily overlooked, easily forgotten. The narrative was reduced to the simplest form: a troubled starlet, undone by despair. It was a familiar Hollywood ending, almost rehearsed. But to those who had known Dorothy, the conclusion rang hollow. Friends remembered her speaking just days earlier of new opportunities, new plans, a fresh start. She had been preparing to perform again, to step back onto the nightclub stage. Was that the language of a woman planning her own end? Or was it, as some suspected, the hopeful self-deception of someone standing too close to the brink. There is an unsettling motif in this part of her story: the medical language itself. Terms like toxicology and poisoning flatten the human life behind them, turning Dorothy into a specimen, not a woman. In death, as in life, she was dissected, interpreted, controlled by forces outside herself. What the autopsy declared, the world accepted, because the truth was less important than the tidiness of the narrative. Philosophically, this points to a deeper tension: the need for closure versus the persistence of ambiguity. Humans crave definitive answers, yet lives like Dorothy's resist them. Her story, too layered with contradictions, cannot be neatly reduced to dosage charts and cause of death codes. To look at her autopsy is to stare into a document that insists on clarity while radiating uncertainty. Her funeral, days later, only amplified this duality. Hollywood sent flowers, journalists sent headlines, but very few came in person. The industry that had once celebrated her as a starlet now retreated in silence, leaving her to be mourned by family, a handful of friends, and a world already shifting its gaze elsewhere. In the pews, the atmosphere was hushed, but beneath the hymns was a question that no sermon could answer. Was this death inevitable, or was something left unseen? The coffin closed, but the questions did not. Could her fractured finances, her strained romances, her debts to questionable figures have played a role? Did someone stand to gain from her sudden absence? Or was the truth tragically simple, that a woman who had carried too much for too long had finally succumbed to the chemical silence of pills? An autopsy can reveal the body, but not the soul. It can tell us what was ingested, how the heart failed, but not why she reached for the bottle, nor whether she did so willingly. Dorothy's death certificate offered a conclusion, but it was one written in sterile ink. The dream that was Dorothy Dandridge, her struggle, her brilliance, her contradictions remained far too complex to be contained in a single phrase. And so, the autopsy of her dream only left another paradox. The world wanted certainty. Dorothy left behind mystery. For some, the clinical neatness of Dorothy Dandridge's death was almost too convenient. The whispers began quickly. Was it truly an accident, or had someone helped push her toward the end? Dorothy's finances had become perilously entangled in the years leading up to her death. Once a headliner commanding thousands per show, she had been left nearly destitute. Managers mismanaged her funds, accountants siphoned away money, and lawsuits drained what little remained. By the summer of 1965, Dorothy's home was mortgaged beyond hope, and creditors circled like vultures. She spoke of selling her house, of trying desperately to start again. But to those who knew her vulnerability was plain. A star surrounded by shadows, eager to profit from her fall. Among those shadows were men of questionable reputation, lovers, who drifted in and out of her life, some with ties to gambling. Others whispered to have connections far more dangerous. Rumors spread that Dorothy had borrowed money she could not repay, that debts bound her to men who had no patience for failure. If true, such debts might explain the strange contradictions of her final scene. A tidy room, no note, a death that silenced questions as much as it invited them. There was also the curious matter of her life insurance. Policies stood to benefit certain individuals, and death, particularly one officially ruled accidental, was a far more profitable conclusion than a star attempting a comeback. This detail was never proved, never pursued by authorities, but in the hushed world of Hollywood gossip, it was repeated like a prayer. The motif of whispers is fitting here. Nothing was ever shouted, nothing ever confirmed, but the murmur of foul play ran beneath every conversation. Whispers in smoky lounges, whispers in studio backlots, whispers in the cramped hallways of Franklin Towers. Each whisper added weight to the notion that Dorothy's death had not been hers alone to decide. Psychologically, suspicion thrives where clarity falters. Human beings, faced with contradictions, will often choose conspiracy over coincidence. But in Dorothy's case, the inconsistencies were genuine. Why was no water glass present if she had swallowed a lethal dose? Why had she spoken of plans for the future only days before? Why the bruises, the fractured toe, details that seem to suggest movement, struggle, interruption? It is tempting, in retrospect, to paint Dorothy as a victim of forces beyond her control. Hollywood's racism, men's exploitation, financial betrayal, but the whispers of foul play add another layer, one that chills the spine, that someone, somewhere, may have wanted her gone. And in a city where illusions are currency, erasing her would not require spectacle, only silence. The truth remains obscured, sealed in a night without witnesses. What lingers are questions, suspicions, and the uneasy recognition that Dorothy's death fit too neatly into the tragic arc assigned to her by the world. A beautiful woman, alone, undone by despair, that story was palatable. It required no further investigation, but beneath the official narrative, the whispers never stopped. They still echo in the shadows of Hollywood, where every dream has its price, and every death, its hidden hands. When Dorothy Dandridge died, the news barely trembled across Hollywood. Headlines appeared. Yes, star of Carmen Jones found dead at 42, but within days the spotlight turned elsewhere, as though her passing were only another footnote in the city's endless obituary of forgotten dreams. For an actress who had once been called the future of cinema, the silence was deafening. This vanishing act was not accidental. Hollywood has always been adept at erasure, at quietly folding away lives that no longer serve the myth of the industry. Dorothy, once paraded across screens as a barrier breaker, had become inconvenient, a reminder of the promises the system had failed to keep. She had proven that a black woman could lead a film, captivate audiences, and command critical acclaim. But the industry, unwilling to follow through on her achievement, chose instead to let her fade. Even in her death, this pattern persisted. The funeral was sparsely attended by the Hollywood elite. Few of the powerful faces who had once applauded her brilliance dared to stand beside her coffin. The cameras that had once adored her cheekbones now turned elsewhere. What was left was the illusion that Dorothy had simply disappeared, absorbed into the machinery of forgetting. The motif of disappearance haunts this chapter. Dorothy did not merely die. She was erased, made invisible in the very city that once put her on every poster. To vanish in life is one thing. To vanish in death is another. A second burial that leaves the soul wandering without witness. Philosophically, erasure is perhaps more violent than death itself. Death is final, but erasure denies the meaning of what came before. Dorothy's life had been one of struggle and triumph, yet the narrative assigned to her was reductive, a tragic beauty undone by her own weaknesses. It was easier for Hollywood to remember her that way than to confront the uncomfortable truth that the system had used her, celebrated her, and abandoned her. For years afterward, Dorothy's name was invoked only in passing, usually in lists of fallen stars or tragic beauties. Rarely was her artistry discussed, her courage honored, her history preserved. She had been reduced to an archetype, the fragile starlet, the dreamer destroyed. In this way, Hollywood's vanishing act was complete. And yet, like any ghost, Dorothy resisted the silence. Those who had seen her perform remembered her voice low, sultry, resonant, as something impossible to erase. Old reels of Carmen Jones flickered on television screens, and audiences discovered her anew, decades too late. The mirage had cracked, but the image remained. The vanishing act was imperfect. Memory, stubborn and restless, refused to let her go entirely. Dorothy's story lingered in whispers, in footnotes, in the shadows of every black actress who followed. Each time a new star stepped into the light, Dorothy's absence became visible again, a reminder that she had opened the door, only to be pushed back into obscurity. Hollywood may have tried to erase Dorothy Dandridge, but erasure, like illusion, is never absolute. Somewhere, in the faint glow of old projectors and in the silences that follow her name, her ghost waits an echo of a woman the world tried to forget, but never could. The details of Dorothy Dandridge's apartment on the night she died remain frozen in memory, each object bearing a mute testimony. Among them was the mirror, tall and unbroken, standing silently in her bedroom. Unlike the fractured stories told about her, the mirror's glass held itself intact, reflecting only the dim light of a space abandoned by its occupant. There is something uncanny about an unbroken mirror in the presence of death. In folklore, mirrors were once covered after someone passed to prevent the soul from becoming trapped in the glass. Dorothy's mirror was not covered, not shattered, not disturbed. It simply remained, a clear surface that no longer had her image to return. In that way, it symbolized the cruelest truth. The reflection was gone, but the surface endured. The apartment itself spoke in quiet contradictions. Clothes were neatly folded in drawers. A gown hung in anticipation of another evening. Shoes aligned by the wall, waiting for footsteps that never came. Nothing in the space suggested despair or finality. Instead, it looked like a room waiting for life to return, frozen in the pause between departure and return. It was this tidiness, this eerie stillness that unsettled those who later walked inside. Forensic details could not account for the mood of the space. The lack of chaos, the absence of signs of struggle, the symmetry of objects left in place, these elements resisted the narrative of overdose. If Dorothy had chosen that night to end her life, would there not have been some trace of decision? A note? A gesture? Even disorder in her final movements? Instead, what was left behind was stillness, and stillness invites speculation. Psychologically, mirrors embody the duality of self, the person seen by the world, and the person hidden within. Dorothy had lived her life before mirrors, adjusting herself into the image the world demanded. But the unbroken mirror on the night of her death was no longer an accomplice in performance. It simply stood, vacant, as if testifying that the performance had ended. Friends who remembered Dorothy often recalled her meticulousness, the way she cared for appearances even in her most private moments. The alignment of her shoes, the careful folding of her dresses, were habits of a woman who believed in order against chaos. And yet here was the ultimate contradiction. Her life ended in disorder, but her surroundings remained immaculate. It was as though she had staged her own absence, leaving behind a tableau designed to puzzle. The mirror motif deepens this paradox. In life, Dorothy had been Hollywood's mirror, reflecting America's aspirations and its fears, beauty that both captivated and unsettled, success that both inspired and exposed hypocrisy. In death, the unbroken mirror in her bedroom became a symbol of that role. It remained intact, but its subject had disappeared. Philosophically, one might say that mirrors are indifferent. They do not care who stands before them. They reflect faithfully until there is nothing left to reflect. In Dorothy's case, the mirror did not shatter under the weight of her absence. It held steady, silent, offering nothing but the void. And perhaps that is the most haunting image of all. A mirror, unbroken, waiting for a face that will never return. In that room, everything appeared in order. And yet nothing was in order at all. Dorothy Dandridge's death was not the end of her story. If anything, it marked the beginning of her transformation into something larger than life, a haunting presence that continues to hover over Hollywood. She became a ghost, not in the literal sense, but in the cultural imagination, an unresolved figure whose absence feels unfinished, whose silence continues to demand explanation. In the years following her death, Her name flickered on and off the edges of history. For decades, she was remembered less as the pioneering actress she truly was, and more as a tragic archetype, another fallen beauty, another fragile starlet undone. Hollywood's machinery preferred this tidy version of events because it was easier to swallow than the truth that Dorothy had been both exalted and abandoned, celebrated and erased. But ghosts have a way of returning when least expected. In the 1982nd and 92nd, a new generation began to rediscover Dorothy. Film historians unearthed her performances, critics re-examined her career, and young black actresses spoke her name with reverence. Halle Berry, in particular, brought her memory roaring back into the public eye with a biographical film, a tribute to the woman whose struggles paved the way for others. Slowly, the narrative began to shift from tragic victim to trailblazer, from cautionary tale to cultural icon. Still, the mystery of her death lingers like perfume in a closed room. The unanswered questions, the tidy apartment, the unbroken mirror, the contradictions in the autopsy remain as potent now as they were in 1965. It is as if Dorothy herself resists being defined by one final moment. Her ghost refuses reduction. Her story cannot be confined to a death certificate. The motif of haunting is not only about the supernatural, but also about memory. We are haunted by what is unresolved, by what refuses to fit neatly into explanation. Dorothy's ghost is this very refusal. She haunts Hollywood because her life revealed the industry's hypocrisy, because her death revealed its indifference. She haunts the culture because beauty and tragedy still fascinate us, because her image, immaculate in black and white stills, glowing in reels of Carmen Jones, remains impossible to forget. Philosophically, one might say that Dorothy embodies the paradox of fame itself, to be remembered and forgotten at the same time, immortalized and erased. Fame makes ghosts of the living long before death arrives, trapping them in images and illusions. For Dorothy, death only sealed the transformation. She became both absent and eternal. Today, her story resonates not only as a mystery but as a warning. It speaks to the cost of visibility, the toll of carrying history on one's shoulders, the cruelty of a system that consumes pioneers and discards them once they have served their purpose. Dorothy Dandridge's ghost reminds us that progress is never without sacrifice, and that beauty does not shield one from suffering. And so her image remains, reflected in mirrors she once faced, echoed in the voices of actresses who followed her, etched into the memory of a city that tried to forget her but could not. A ghost, yes, but also a beacon. A reminder that even in silence, even in mystery, Dorothy Dandridge continues to speak. Her story ends not with an answer, but with an echo that refuses to fade.